Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Look, if you're a Ball B student currently prepping for your environmental law exam, you have landed in exactly the right place. Grab your notes because we are diving straight into an incredibly detailed, comprehensive academic breakdown of Professor Cass R. Sunstein's famous analysis of the Montreal and Kyoto protocols, and we're not just stopping there. To make sure you absolutely nail every detail for your exam, we are also going to dissect the rigorous counterarguments and critiques from major legal scholars, specifically Daniel Barstow-McGraw, Peter Orszag, and Terry Denon. We're going to look at the hard data, the underlying legal theories, and the gritty geopolitical realities that drove it all.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is your ultimate study guide for today. First, we'll cover a tale of two protocols. Then, the cost-benefit reality, followed by the Kyoto dilemma, winners, losers, and equity, flaws in the formula, and we'll wrap it all up with the insurance policy.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, a tale of two protocols, ozone versus climate.
We have to begin with a massive, glaring paradox. Montreal and Kyoto actually look like very similar global crises on paper, right? They both involve these huge planetary risks, and they both desperately require international agreements. Yet, just look at this stark contrast. On the left, you've got the Montreal Protocol of 1987. This is a spectacular textbook success story. It achieved unanimous U.S. ratification, it sparked incredibly aggressive industrial innovation, and it literally led to a 95% global reduction in ozone-depleting chemicals. Fast forward to the right side of the screen, the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. The United States completely and firmly rejected it. They cited prohibitive costs, and this rejection was backed by a unanimous, bipartisan Senate resolution. No way were they signing it. On top of that, many of the nations that actually did ratify it seriously struggled with compliance. And crucially, major global emitters like China were completely exempt from any binding targets. Now, you might be thinking, well, don't both of these global problems raise profound moral and legal questions about intergenerational and international equity? I mean, the historical reality is that wealthy nations largely created these environmental crises through industrialization, while poorer nations and generations that aren't even born yet are the ones who are going to be most vulnerable to the fallout. It's a huge ethical dilemma. But here's the kicker for your exam. Sunstein's core thesis argues something incredibly pragmatic, maybe even cynical. He posits that a nation's willingness to act actually does not hinge primarily on these moral imperatives. Instead, he argues, it hinges almost entirely on a purely domestic assessment of perceived costs versus perceived benefits.
Which brings us right to Section 2, the cost-benefit reality. Let's look at the exact numbers the U.S. government was staring at.
Look at the sheer scale of these benefits on the screen. It is honestly mind-blowing. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency projected that by drastically cutting chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, the United States alone would avert over 5 million skin cancer deaths and 25 million cataract cases by the year 2165. When you monetize that human health impact, it results in a staggering $3.5 trillion in domestic benefits just for the U.S. And what was the expected cost to industry to make this switch? A mere $21 billion. When you have a domestic cost-benefit ratio that is this overwhelmingly positive, it's a total no-brainer. The U.S. had literally every economic incentive to aggressively lead the world in ratifying Montreal. But now, flip the page and contrast that with the Kyoto Protocol projections. Sunstein points out that based on highly prominent models from economists like Nordhaus and Boyer, unilateral compliance with Kyoto would cost the U.S. $325 billion while yielding virtually zero domestic benefits. Zero. And even if you imagine a scenario with full global compliance, U.S. domestic benefits were projected at only $12 billion against that $325 billion cost. So from a purely domestic, self-interested standpoint, Sunstein argues that Kyoto was, objectively speaking, an absolutely terrible bargain for America.
So moving to Section 3, the Kyoto dilemma, high costs, low impact. Now, it wasn't just a bad deal for the United States. Even when you zoom out to the world as a whole, prominent analysts projected that Kyoto's massive compliance costs would completely outweigh its benefits. We're talking about a global net negative of either $242 billion or $119 billion, depending on the model. Furthermore, Nordhaus and Boyer estimated that even with all that money spent, Kyoto would only reduce anticipated global warming by a meager 0.03 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. That is practically a rounding error for hundreds of billions of dollars.
So why in the world would the global impact be so tiny? Well, Sunstein identifies a few massive structural flaws that you definitely want to remember. First, climate change is a function of aggregate global emissions. It's everyone combined. Because Kyoto explicitly exempted rapidly developing nations like China and India from binding obligations, the massive future emissions growth from these nations would essentially wipe out any of the hard-won reductions made by Western countries. Second, greenhouse gases linger in the atmosphere for a very long time. Past emissions are going to continue to cause warming regardless of what new cuts we make today. And finally, the treaty only required pretty modest cuts anyway, aiming to return emissions to just below 1990 levels. In the grand scheme of the aggregate global problem, that simply wasn't enough to move the needle.
Section 4, Winners, Losers, and Equity. Let's dig into the geopolitics of climate change.
I want you to consider this question carefully because it's absolutely crucial for your exam prep. Why exactly would the world's absolute largest greenhouse gas emitters, the US and China, hesitate to commit to stringent controls? To really understand this, we have to look closely at how different nations project their own domestic damages from global warming. It's not a level playing field.
Let's break down these projections. This data is absolutely fascinating. This table models the expected percentage of GDP loss or gain from a 2.5 degrees Celsius warming event. Look closely at India and Africa. They are facing devastating expected agricultural and health losses, nearly a 5% and 4% hit to their entire GDP respectively. But look down at the bottom of the chart. The United States expects a very minimal GDP loss of only 0.45%. China expects an even smaller loss of 0.22%. And Russia? Russia is actually projected to gain 0.65% in GDP, largely due to potential agricultural benefits from a warmer climate thawing their northern regions. So, Sunstein argues that because the biggest global emitters actually expect the least amount of domestic damage, their natural incentive to act is drastically reduced.
And this dynamic creates a massive ethical standoff. Just look at the historic emissions from 1850 to 2002. The US and the European Union are collectively responsible for over 55% of the total historic greenhouse gases currently sitting in the atmosphere. China, on the other hand, despite being the largest current emitter right now, is only responsible for about 7.8% of historic emissions. Put yourself in their shoes. Developing nations argue that it is fundamentally inherently unfair to demand that they sacrifice their current economic and industrial growth to solve a crisis that was primarily created by a century and a half of historic industrialization in the West.
All right, moving into Section 5, Flaws in the Formula. It is time to critique Sunstein's whole cost-benefit approach.
Enter legal scholar Daniel Barstow McGraw. He strongly challenges Sunstein's entire framework here. He basically argues that trying to compare the localized, very medically specific issue of ozone depletion to the vast, incomprehensible planetary complexity of climate change is highly misleading. In fact, he states bluntly that cost-benefit analyses of the Kyoto Protocol are so speculative and so incomplete that they are essentially meaningless for setting actual legal or international policy.
Get your highlighters ready because you need this list of McGraw's specific legal critiques for your exam. First, he points out that cost-benefit analysis completely fails to account for massive scientific uncertainty. How do you put a price tag on unpredictable cataclysmic tipping points, like the Gulf Stream entirely collapsing? You can't. Second, you simply cannot monetize certain interests, like the loss of indigenous human cultures, fundamental ethics, or basic ecosystem services. Third, CBA inherently relies on market prices. McGraw argues it is completely surreal to use standard market pricing when you're trying to assess what is essentially the largest market failure in human history. Fourth, traditional economic discount rates, which economists use to value future costs, fail completely when you're measuring catastrophic harms that span multiple centuries and unborn generations. Fifth, CBA completely ignores a sovereign nation's fundamental obligation to protect basic human rights to life and property. And finally, it ignores what he calls the demonstration effect, which is the absolute political reality that developing nations will not act until industrialized nations, who caused the problem in the first place, show some leadership and act first.
Furthermore, McGraw argues that the United States didn't reject Kyoto because some officials sat down and calculated a formal cost-benefit analysis spreadsheet. Not at all. He observes that the rejection was deeply, inherently political. McGraw points to the context of that specific era. We're talking about an aggressively anti-regulatory Congress, an administration with extremely strong documented ties to fossil fuel industries, and a Senate that routinely refused to ratify multilateral environmental treaties across the board, like the Law of the Sea. McGraw also notes a great legal point. The U.S. Clean Air Act actually prohibits the EPA from making decisions solely based on cost-benefit analysis anyway. According to McGraw's interpretation, this was a gut-level political rejection, famously summarized by President Bush at the time, who reportedly stated that signing the Kyoto Protocol simply, quote, wouldn't be cool.
Finally, we reach Section 6, the insurance policy. Let's look at an entirely different way to frame this. So Sunstein suggests that if we want to get the U.S. to join a global treaty, we really need global cap-and-trade programs, or carbon taxes that forcefully include developing nations. But scholars Peter Orszag and Terry Danan jump in here and point out a massive, critical flaw in Sunstein's own logic. Think about it. To actually get China to agree to a global cap-and-trade system, the U.S. would inevitably have to allocate a massive amount of emissions allowances to them to get them to the table. This essentially transfers vast, unprecedented amounts of wealth straight from the U.S. to China. Therefore, these proposed solutions actually increase economic costs for the U.S. without raising its domestic climate benefits at all, meaning it completely fails to solve the exact domestic self-interest problem that Sunstein identified in the first place. So how do we solve this? Well, Orszag and Danan propose an entirely different economic framework. They argue we must completely abandon the standard marginal cost-benefit comparisons when dealing with climate change. Instead, they propose what they call an insurance perspective. They argue that restricting carbon emissions shouldn't be viewed as a standard one-to-one investment return. Rather, it's like buying a global insurance policy. You pay a premium right now, which is the economic cost of strict regulation, to buy a reduction in the risk of triggering unpredictable, totally irreversible global catastrophes that go way, way beyond standard economic modeling.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought to take into your exam. The ultimate paradox of international environmental law is precisely this friction. Can we ever design a treaty that satisfies the strict, domestic economic self-interest of the world's most powerful sovereign nations while simultaneously fulfilling the urgent, moral imperative of securing global survival for absolutely everyone? Understanding this profound tension between Sunstein's cold, pragmatic cost-benefit reality and the deeply ethical, catastrophic risks outlined by McGraw, Orszag, and Danan, that is your key to totally mastering this topic. Best of luck on your environmental law exam. You're going to crush it, and thank you so much for joining us on this explainer.